Hi, my name is Steve Tegler. I'm a Director of Technical Product Management here at VMware in our Cloud Native Apps business unit. And this Lightboard session is all about giving Kubernetes to you in 5 minutes. And it's going to be a little bit of a challenge, so I'm going to have to brush over a lot of detailed concepts in Kubernetes, but I want to give you a rough idea of what is it and what does it actually do and what is it responsible for. So there's a few different architectural components, two of which I'm going to talk about. The first of which is the Kubernetes cluster services. And you know, the fundamental premise behind Kubernetes is that we can enforce what's called desired state management. And really what that means is that I'm going to feed the cluster services a specific configuration, and it will be up to the cluster services to go out and run that configuration in my infrastructure. Okay? One of the main components that I do want to call out is this API that sits in front of all this in the API services. So that is one building block of the system. The second building block of the system is this thing called a worker. And what is a worker? Well, a worker is really just a container host. The one thing unique about a worker or the container host in a Kubernetes environment is that it does have this kubelet process that runs, which is responsible for communicating with, yes, you guessed it, the Kubernetes cluster services. And so this whole thing, the cluster services, the workers themselves, that's what makes up this quote-unquote Kubernetes cluster. So let's talk about the use case here. So in this case, what we want to do is we want to feed this the configuration. So the desired state, so to speak, exists here in a deployment YAML file. So here I'm just going to call it application1.yaml. And inside this, there can be a whole bunch of configuration information, and I am going to bypass quite a bit of it, but I'm going to talk about two fundamental pieces. The first of which, in this deployment file, is a pod configuration. And a pod is like the smallest unit of deployment in Kubernetes in terms of the Kubernetes object model. And what it means is that in a pod, I can have running containers. And you can have one or more. So in order to run that pod, I need to specify some sort of container image. Maybe I want to have 2 container images. And further down the line, there's other things like what TCP port and where our service is running or whatnot. But the other additional thing is that I'm going to specify how many of these pods need to be running here. So maybe there's 3 for pod number 1. I can also list additional pods. So here's pod, here, let me use a different color. So pod number 2, and I basically have container image number 3, and then replicas off my configuration file equal to 2. So what happens is I will take this deployment file, I will feed it to the API, and it will be up to the cluster services to figure out how to schedule these pods in the environment and make sure that I have the right number of pods running. So I feed this file over here. Let's work on pod 1. So I'm going to have pod 1 replica 1, pod 1 replica 2, pod 1 replica 3. In addition, I've also got my pod 2. So here we are, pod 2 replica 1. And in this case, we only have 2 replicas here. So let's just do pod 1 replica 2 here. And so you can see at any point in time, the cluster services are responsible to make sure that configuration is running across all of my container hosts or my workers. So what's a unique scenario that happens here? What happens if I lose a worker? Now my running configuration, because that pod is now dead, my running configuration does not match this. And it's up to the Kubernetes cluster services through the kubelet process that's running to notify me of that and to understand what's actually running. So what I've done is I actually dropped this pod 1 replica 2. So therefore, the scheduler has to make a scheduling decision on where I need to instantiate that. So it will just pick one of the workers. Whoops. That will be pod 1, and in this case, this is replica 2. So this is kind of the basics of Kubernetes in 5 minutes. Hope you enjoyed it. Stay tuned for more Lightboard sessions on the subject of Kubernetes with Photon Platform. Thanks.